Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to this public forum on the importance of freedom of information and the obligation of Australia's government to protect the rights of its citizens. I'm Mary Kostakidis. I'd like to begin by acknowledging the traditional owners of this land and pay our respects to their elders, past and present. The Sydney Peace Foundation is grateful to our partners and supporters in this event: Amnesty International, Get Up, Stop the War Coalition and the many organisations that got in touch with us and said that they wanted to support us and would be here tonight. Thank each and every one of you for turning up here this evening in such numbers, demonstrating that your interest in engaging with issues that are at the core of our democracy. We salute and thank the Lord Mayor of Sydney, Clover Moore, and the City of Sydney for the value they place on empowering citizens and throwing open the doors of the Town Hall so that we could meet here tonight. Now, I have a message for the forum from Amnesty International. It's a short statement which I'd like to read to you. Amnesty International supports WikiLeaks' right to freedom of expression through the publication of information and ideas, as guaranteed in the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights. Amnesty International also welcomes efforts to put information about human rights abuses into the public domain, and a number of WikiLeaks documents have revealed such abuses to international scrutiny. In the matter of Private Bradley Manning, the soldier accused of leaking information to WikiLeaks, Amnesty International is appalled by the harsh and degrading conditions of his incarceration and has called on US Defence Secretary Robert Gates to review his situation. Thank you, Amnesty. Now, a quick rundown of what's going to happen tonight. So, yeah, I'm going to come to that later. We're not going to forget Bradley Manning, don't worry about that. A quick rundown of what we are going to do tonight. We'll hear from our three speakers, journalist John Pilger, Andrew Wilkie MP and Julian Burnside QC, who will address you for about 15 minutes each, after which you'll have an opportunity to ask questions for around half an hour to 40 minutes. And then, before John Pilger wraps up by telling us what further action we can take, I've got a few announcements to make, including the winners of our raffle, the Lucky Door prizes. Now, our speakers are all prominent Australians who have a track record of holding governments to account for actions they take in our name, and they're here today because yet again we are seeing the failure of our government to uphold basic human rights, the freedom of expression and the presumption of innocence. You have answered the call for citizens of this city to support a courageous Australian, one who is now confronting the cost of that courage and the cost of his conviction that truth matters. The most powerful government in the world is seeking to prosecute Julian Assange under laws that carry the death penalty. It's trying to shut down WikiLeaks, the whistleblowing website that has in many cases made revelations that have affected the course of democracy, often the course, in fact, of history, a website that has changed the balance of power between the governed and the governors. At first, our Prime Minister wrongly declared it illegal. Now she's written WikiLeaks off as just anarchic, ignoring the litany of critical revelations it's made in its short history. Revelations such as the widespread killing of innocent civilians, including, in one incident, 2 Reuters newsmen, where Reuters had tried for 2 years to get hold of that now notorious Iraq video under Freedom of Information laws. They were entitled to know what happened to their employees, as were the men's families, as was the public. secret reports on corruption by Kenyan politicians leading to a change of government in that country, plus a secret report into the disappearance of 500 young Kenyan protesters. Amnesty awarded Julian Assange its media award in 2009 for publishing that report because until then, there was no media that would publish that report. Because it was published on WikiLeaks, the London Times picked it up, a UN special investigator investigated and corroborated the findings. Corrupt behaviour in banks that triggered a meltdown of the Icelandic economy, leading to the prosecution of corporate heads and the strengthening of whistleblower legislation in Iceland. And many revelations in cables, including the opulent lifestyle of the Tunisian leadership, which contributed to their overthrow by the Tunisian people, an event that triggered a great wave of demand for dignity and respect in the Arab world ruled by autocrats. Now, I'm going to try and give as many of you as possible the opportunity to ask questions later, but I'd like to give each and every one of you here right now the opportunity to have a say. I'm going to put a question to you, and the answer is very simple, yes or no. But you've got to make your answer loud and clear because it's got to be heard all the way to Canberra, where politicians are echoing the words of Hillary Clinton. Hillary Clinton says WikiLeaks is a danger to the world. What do you think? Thank you. Good. Now, we want to hear more from you later, so start formulating those short, sharp questions. John Pilger is a controversial journalist because he takes a position on injustice and human rights. He chronicles an alternative history because it's a history that gives a voice to the powerless. Mindful of the emphasis placed on balance and neutrality in journalism, the director of the Sydney Peace Foundation, Stuart Rees, said in announcing the Sydney Peace Prize to John Pilger in 2009, injustice is almost always about imbalance. John Pilger.
This is a secret document. It's dated September the 29th, 2009. It was leaked from the Ministry of Defence in London to WikiLeaks. It identifies what it calls the greatest threats to the national security of the West. At the top of the list are terrorists and Russian spies. Yes, Russian spies. But by far the biggest threat is said to come from one group: journalists, investigative journalists. How gratifying that is. In other words, journalists who do their job, who tell you, the public, how and why politicians lie to you and start wars in your name and threaten your security, must somehow be stopped, coerced, even smeared. This is another secret document, leaked, of course, by WikiLeaks. This one is from the Pentagon in Washington and explains a great deal about the predicament facing Julian Assange. It's dated almost exactly 3 years ago and describes the planning of a smear campaign to destroy WikiLeaks. And I quote, "Destroying WikiLeaks' centre of gravity, its public trust. And this would be achieved with," and I quote, "threats of exposure and criminal prosecution," unquote, 3 years ago. Silencing a rare source of independent journalism is the explicit aim, smear is the method. Why? Because the real threat is not WikiLeaks or Julian Assange, but you, the public. The real threat is you finding out the truth about those who pretend to be democratic and to act in your interests and to promote a peaceful world. The real threat is your right to call your government to account. And by that I don't mean the usual circus of Tweedledee and Tweedledum, with the very honourable exception of Andrew Wilkie. Competing for your vote, but the telling of truths that allow us to examine the cynicism that defines Australia's place in the world increasingly. When the truth is replaced by silence, said the Soviet dissident Yevtushenko, the silence is a lie. This meeting tonight is about Australia's silence on the denigration of basic liberties such as freedom of speech and the presumption of innocence. It's about the right of Australians to know what their government is doing in their name in secret. It's about the duty of those charged with alerting the public to the truth: journalists, broadcasters, writers, academics, to end their compliance with rapacious power. To be corrupted by totalitarianism, wrote George Orwell, one does not have to live in a totalitarian country. And it's about the plight of an Australian citizen, and a very courageous one, Julian Assange, threatened with an epic miscarriage of justice and incarceration in a hellhole in America, like the heroic Bradley Manning, whose conditions of torture President Obama called the other day appropriate. In 1917, Edward Bernays, the American nephew of Sigmund Freud, invented the term public relations as a euphemism for propaganda, which he said the Germans had given a bad name. Bernays was the father of spin. He described spin as the intelligent manipulation of the public with, quote, false realities, which a compliant media would dispense. He called this an invisible government that is the true ruling power in democracies. Declassified official files from the past tell us how this invisible government has worked. In 1968, the British Chiefs of Staff wrote, and I quote, "The Soviet Union will not deliberately start general war or even limited war in Europe," unquote. This was in stark contrast to what the propaganda disguised as journalism told us year after year. Imagine, just imagine, if we'd had WikiLeaks then. The Cold War might have ended long before the Berlin Wall came down. In the 1960s, Prime Minister Robert Menzies lied to us that the Saigon regime had pleaded with Australia to go to war in Vietnam. In fact, we know now that this was false, that Menzies sent our young men to that war on a lie, hoping to impress Washington. He didn't give a damn about the people of Vietnam. Imagine, just imagine, if we'd had WikiLeaks then. All those diggers who died might have lived. That suffering might not have happened. Today, something has changed. Reality is no longer what governments and their echoes in the media say it is. Of all the spectacular revolts across the world, the most exciting and hopeful is the insurrection of knowledge, much of it sparked by WikiLeaks. I know this to be true because over the years, as a reporter and a witness, I have watched the effect of subjugated knowledge give power to people almost instantaneously, from Southeast Asia to the Chagos Islands to the people of East Timor. In those cases, governments said one thing in private and lied in public. Their reaction in being caught out, as I know from personal experience, and Andrew Wilkie certainly knows from personal experience, is ruthless and rough. They hate it. They hate the democracy of knowledge. And they abuse and they smear, and worse, as Julian Assange now knows all too well. In Australia, we have an urgent and critical part to play, for unless we make our voices heard now, Julian Assange is likely to end up in a Kafkaesque judicial system in the US, which is now so corrupted that not a single detainee since 9/11 has been accorded any redress in America's courts, including innocent people detained for years and tortured. Sitting with us today, at my invitation, is one of those people. Like Julian Assange, he's a courageous Australian citizen who was denied the help of his government. His name is David Hicks. For 6 years, David was incarcerated in the hellhole of Guantanamo. He was beaten for hours on end, his bones were broken, and things were done to him that you can't imagine. David was tried in a military kangaroo court, yet has not received legal redress nor a cent in compensation from the US regime or from his own government in Canberra that allowed this outrage to go on and on. I was going to then ask you to join me in showing your support for justice for David, but you've already done that. And thank you. David Hicks. David Hicks broke no Australian law. Even John Howard admitted this. His conviction was illegal. In 2003, the then Shadow Attorney General Robert McClelland demanded a public inquiry into the treatment of David Hicks. 8 years later, McClelland is the Attorney General and his silence is a scandal. What David Hicks and Julian Assange have in common is that 2 Prime Ministers and 2 Attorney Generals have thrown these Australians into a chasm of injustice and suffering. Julian Assange and WikiLeaks have broken no law and are charged with no crime. And yet it's clear the Gillard government is trying to do to Assange what Howard did to David Hicks. Not only has the Prime Minister defamed Assange in suggesting he was guilty of and charged with a crime, not only has the Attorney General threatened to take away the passport of an Australian citizen guilty of no crime, we now learn that they have secretly discussed a charge of treason against Assange. I know that the Attorney General has been personally made fully aware that the circumstances of Assange's problems in Sweden stink. Something is rotten in the state of Denmark, said Marcellus in Hamlet. I would substitute Sweden for Denmark. The other day, the Sydney Morning Herald declared that Assange should give up his appeal and be extradited from Britain. The paper calls Sweden a neutral country. Sweden has not been a neutral country for 30 years. 2 weeks ago, a parliamentary briefing in Canberra heard expert evidence that under international standards, the behaviour of leading figures in the Assange case in Sweden would be considered, and I quote, highly improper and reprehensible and preclude a fair trial. The Swedish Prime Minister is a warmongering mate of George W. Bush and has hired Bush's crony, Karl Rove, to advise him on the problem of Julian Assange. The law partner of one of the leading figures pursuing Assange was the Minister of Justice, who in 2001 secretly handed over 2 innocent asylum seekers to a CIA kidnap squad at Stockholm Airport. Sweden later awarded them damages for their torture in Egypt. The implications for Julian Assange in Sweden are dire. Not a word of this critical hearing in Canberra was reported or broadcast in the mainstream media in Australia. Instead, we've been saturated with the spectacle of Julia Gillard in Washington. Yet again, an Australian Prime Minister has made us a laughingstock. In her so-called historic address to Congress, a Congress half filled with interns and minor officials, Gillard surpassed Robert Menzies' notorious declaration of love for the Queen. It actually reminded me of a grovelling Stalinist party boss in Eastern Europe summoned to Moscow during the Cold War. That her foreign minister was at the same time ranging the Middle East, trying to start an air war over Libya, added a macabre element to the whole farce. The Australian media reported that Gillard's speech was punctuated with ovations, with members rising to their feet. Have they no clue that all of this is orchestrated? Watch the footage of Blair during the same turn, and Bush and Obama. The standing ovations are mandatory. It's what Edward Bernays would call false reality. However, there was serious purpose: to ensure that Australian troops remain in Afghanistan, that disaster where NATO's latest achievement is the killing of 9 children collecting firewood. Have we no pride? Have we no historical sense that with every Prime Minister we elect, the first priority is the wishes of the United States, a nation whose record of violence is documented in the crushing of 50 governments since World War II, many of them democracies? It's no wonder that WikiLeaks and real journalism are considered threats, as in that document. In Washington, Gillard described Hillary Clinton as, and I quote, the emblem of female leadership. As WikiLeaks has revealed, this emblem of female leadership ran a secret spy campaign against members of the United Nations, demanding their credit card numbers, passwords, even DNA, all of it illegal. And it was Clinton who in 2008 said she was prepared to, and I quote, annihilate Iran. We have a right to know about these machinations. We have a right to know that Kevin Rudd advised America to attack China if the Chinese didn't do what they were told. We have a right to know that Kim Beazley wanted to commit the Labour Party to an American war with China over Taiwan. That key ALP plotters like Mark Habib are assets of the US Embassy in Canberra. That Obama is no different from Bush, that secret US provocations inside Pakistan now threaten a nuclear war. We have a right to know these things, just as the people of Egypt and Tunisia had the right to know about the corruption of their regimes. and they acted on that information. At the close of this meeting, I'll offer a few thoughts on what I think we might do. Certainly, we can be inspired by what others have already done fearlessly, and we too can then lose our fear. Thank you.
Well, he tells it like it is. Thank you for that inspiring speech, John Pilger. And John's most recent documentary about the media's role in war, called The War We Don't See, will be screened on SBS on the 10th of April, so don't miss it. Now, like Pentagon Papers whistleblower Daniel Ellsberg, Andrew Wilkie's respect for the truth and the public's right to know prevailed over his professional obligations. He refused to be a party to a war launched on a lie. He was the only Western intelligence officer to break ranks over the manufactured justification of the Iraq War. And the people in the federal seat of Denison declared with their vote that they value his courage and his integrity. Ladies and gentlemen, Andrew Wilkie.
Thank you, and I've got to say it's very, very nice to see so many familiar faces here from the campaign against John Howard in 2004 in Bennelong. Now, late last year, and it was widely reported, I singled out Prime Minister Julia Gillard, and I criticised her for showing contempt for the rule of law, showing contempt for the presumption of innocence, and showing contempt for the right to free speech over her response to Julian Assange and WikiLeaks. Now, I'm in a position these days where it seems that whenever I open my mouth, there's no shortage of critics who take me on and try and pull me down. But one of the things that struck me when I spoke out against the Prime Minister late last year was the extraordinary level of support and overwhelmingly positive response I got to my criticism of the Prime Minister. It seems that people from right around Australia, from all sorts of political backgrounds, all sorts of ages, incomes, right around the country, they got in touch with my office with emails, letters and phone calls and so on and said, good on you. Good on you for saying that about the Prime Minister, because it reflected their point of view. And that's very, very telling. Unlike so many other issues I'm involved in, there wasn't a polarising down the middle of, either side of the Australian community. Now, that's not to say that everyone is happy with Julian Assange and WikiLeaks. I, for one, wouldn't do it exactly the way Julian Assange does it with WikiLeaks. And, very serious accusations have been made against Julian Assange at the moment, and there are many Australians who think those accusations should be tested in a court of law. But putting aside those reservations by some Australians, there is clearly an overwhelming number of Australians who are very concerned that this government and this Prime Minister have in fact shown a contempt for the rule of law, accusing Julian Assange of breaking laws that don't even exist and having to retract the accusation under the weight of overwhelming public concern. There's a large number of Australians who are very concerned at the government's contempt for the way it showed contempt for the presumption of innocence. And remember, presumption of innocence is not a luxury, it is a fundamental human right. And it is unacceptable that anyone, and particularly unacceptable that the government of our country should show such contempt for the presumption of innocence. But I think there's much more to it. I think there are a lot of other forces at work in the national concern with what has happened to Julian Assange, or is happening to Julian Assange, and what the resentment being thrown at WikiLeaks. For example, there's the concern about what is happening to our World Wide Web. This government has shown a determination for some time now to censor the internet. And although it has backed off a little bit in recent times and has thrown the matter back at the states and territories and said, well, provide us some advice on this, it is abundantly clear that the Gillard government is determined in due course to impose mandatory filtering of the internet. Now, I think that is wrong. It is inconsistent with the nature of the internet, and it's probably technically impossible. And what we're seeing here with Julian Assange and WikiLeaks is another attempt to censor the internet, which will be to deny it its great strength. There's also a concern in the Australian community, it's almost been burned into our consciousness, about the way a succession of Australian governments have been prepared to treat Australian citizens. John has already spoken about what happened to Mandu Habib. Now, regardless of what you might think of him and what he may or may not have done, the fact that he has now been paid, presumably, a substantial compensation, which must be kept secret from us, is all the proof we need that that man was treated wrongly and that Australian governments were party to that mistreatment. No wonder we are sitting and standing here tonight worried about the treatment being meted out to Julian Assange when we have examples like Habib as our benchmarks. And I'm delighted that we have David Hicks here tonight. Another man regardless of what you think of David and what he might or might not have done in his past, there is no denying, no Australian could deny, that he was seriously mistreated and he was fed into a grinder that has no similarity to any sort of decent justice system any of us would be familiar with. And finally, I was just getting on a bit of a roll there. You know, it was Robert McClellan, no less, who expressed concern about the treatment being meted out to David Hicks. But it turns out that the government now is more concerned about the profits of crime and whether or not he can have any profit he may have made from his book. There seems to be no interest whatsoever in conducting a full and proper inquiry, not into David Hicks, but into the system that treated him the way it did and into the government that allowed it to happen. I am very, very pleased today to have been able to send the word to David, I don't know if he's got it already, that I'll certainly put my signature to a letter to the Prime Minister demanding that there be a full and proper inquiry into what happened to him so it never happens again. Julian Assange is going through, I suppose we might call it the whistleblower grinder. He's certainly not the first person. I had my own experience back in 2003. And my experience is that when you do stand up and try and speak truth to power, it is tough. It is very, very tough culturally in this country where you're seen to be, I don't know, upsetting the status quo, causing waves. It's not the way we do it in Australia. We respect authority in Australia. We don't cause problems and we certainly don't challenge governments or call Prime Ministers liars, as in fact John Howard was back in 2003. For my efforts, I was told, you were told, that I was mad, that I'd never worked in Iraq, that I didn't know what I was talking about, that I wasn't worth listening to. But my story's got a very, very happy ending, and I'm very, very proud to now sit on the crossbenches in the House of Representatives. But what about Alan Kessing, the man who in 2005 was found guilty of a charge he has denied every day since then of leaking documents to the Australian newspaper about security shortfalls at Sydney Airport? Alan Kessing is a man who now carries a guilty conviction. He's broke, he lives in a shack in the Blue Mountains, and still the government refuses to pardon him despite the overwhelming evidence that there was a serious miscarriage of justice, and all he was trying to do was to speak up in the public interest, and in return the government saw him guilty. So what is going on, ladies and gentlemen? Why is it that we live in a country where people like Alan Kessing, David Hicks and others can be treated the way they are doing it? Well, I suppose the government is reflecting in some ways the cultural mood in this country. As I said a moment ago, it is a tough country to speak up. A lot of Australians don't like whistleblowers. It's a dirty word. You know, you compare that with places like the United States, where to be called a whistleblower is in fact a great compliment. But to be called a whistleblower in Australia, and Assange is a whistleblower, it's a dirty word with all sorts of connotations. But the way to overcome that is for government and politicians to act like leaders and to try and overcome those fault lines through the community. And instead they seek to tap into it. And that's exactly what the Prime Minister was doing, particularly late last year, and other members of the government, when they were trying to single out Julian Assange as WikiLeaks as troublemakers, people who are breaking the law, people who are guilty. They are trying to tap into that sentiment in the Australian community, when in fact what they should be doing is acting like leaders and actually taking a neutral role, and in fact, if anything, speaking up for people who try and speak truth to power. The bottom line for me is that this government and the government before it and the government before that, that's the Gillard government, the Rudd government and the Howard government, they are hypocrites, because they talk a lot about freedom of speech, they talk a lot about our fundamental human rights, they talk about the strength of our justice system, they jump through hoops, but at the end of the day they do not want people to speak up. Now, it's worth noting that in the last 6 months, through the Parliament, has passed what are frequently called shield laws, which are, it's a first in Australia. It will provide protection for journalists who publicise the information from whistleblowers, not unlike would apply, which could possibly apply to Julian Assange. But did the Gillard government do that because they wanted shield laws in Australia? No, they did it because a crossbencher demanded it, and they found themselves having to do it. In other words, they were not prepared to do it until it was in their political self-interest to have a shield law in this country, and that's not acceptable. What about whistleblower legislation? For decades, various political parties, probably starting with the Democrats in the 1980s, have tried to get whistleblower legislation up in this country. And yes, the Rudd government made the first cautious steps in the term of the Rudd government, but in essence, the only reason there will be whistleblower legislation established for sure in the term of this parliament is because the crossbenchers and the Greens have demanded it. In other words, it is only happening because it's in the political self-interest of the government, and not because the government has a deep and genuine desire for effective whistleblower protection in this country. And let's not forget, we've just about got shield laws, and I think in 2.5 years' time we will have whistleblower legislation. But that will stand in stark contrast to the hundreds of laws in this country which are there as deterrents and as punishments for people who do speak up. You know, every time I've stood up for the last 8 years and said anything about my time in the Office of National Assessments, I have been arguably liable for up to 2 years' jail under the Crimes Act. Because remarkably in Australia to this day, if a federal public servant reveals anything he or she has learned in the course of their employment for the Federal Public Service, it's 2 years jail. And very interestingly, it's 7 years jail for the media that might publicise it. So what are the solutions? There are lots of solutions. For a start, governments must understand that the rule of law, the presumption of innocence and the right to free speech mean something. They are fundamental rights, and it's a fundamental role of government to protect those rights. They must move quickly to put in place effective legislation to protect those who speak up. And they should certainly move quickly to honour the agreement with me and other politicians to have whistleblower legislation in place before the next election in 2.5 years' time. And they must... And governments must stop kowtowing to the United States because they think our bilateral relationship because they judge that our bilateral relationship with the United States is more valuable than the rights and interests of Australian citizens. And that is exactly what's happening here with Julian Assange. And they must stop tapping into the fault lines in our community. Even if they think it was going to be popular to go after Assange, that doesn't make it right to say the things they said. And it's not the only fault line, I'll add. And some of you would be aware I've spoken up recently at the racism that's eating at the Liberal Party. And even though there's been a debate about this for weeks now, Tony Abbott is yet to effectively discipline Scott Morrison and Corey Bernardi for their racist sentiments. And finally, all of us, the four of us up here, and every one of you down there, we have to continue to fight for freedom of speech, for the rule of law and the presumption of innocence in this country. Because if we back off one bit, the government will continue to act the way they want to act, and that's not good enough.
If only there were more individuals like Andrew Wilkie representing us in federal parliament. Now, Julian Burnside is a beacon in this country for the defence of civil liberties and justice. He's a living national treasure. As you know, he was immortalised in the ABC miniseries Bastard Boys for his role in representing the Maritime Union of Australia in its battle with Patrick Corporation in the 1998 waterfront dispute. One of Australia's longest-running industrial disputes. He's an outspoken advocate for human rights and our obligation to treat asylum seekers humanely. Julian Burnside, QC.
The field has been fairly well ploughed. It's a little bit difficult to know what I can add. I want to go through very briefly what the main players have done in this exercise and what's wrong with it, starting with Julian Assange. Well, he published leaked material, plainly enough. The most dramatic publication was his exposure of murder in Baghdad. There's no great surprise that the Americans were embarrassed by that. Of course, publishing that material was not an offence against any Australian law, and I think it's not an offence against any American law that I'm aware of. But it did embarrass the American government, and I guess that is a sort of unwritten crime, but not one for which you could be convicted. And I suppose the best thing you can say to America is, if you don't want to be embarrassed, stop doing embarrassing things. So, did Assange do anything wrong? Well, the answer is no. And interestingly, I mean, given that what he's done is to publish the material that was leaked by someone else, you've got to look around and admit that Rupert Murdoch has done exactly the same thing, reprinting exactly the same material. But I don't see Rupert Murdoch being attacked by the American government or the Australian government. Now, what's the USA done? Well, the USA branded him a terrorist. They got Visa and MasterCard and PayPal to cut off the source of funds to WikiLeaks. They arrested the whistleblower, Bradley Manning, who arguably may have committed offences if in fact he's the person who leaked the material, and that's very far from clear. But having arrested him, that was not enough. They then threw him in the brig, where he's been held for more than 8 months, and for most of that time held naked and kept in the dark, and they've been preventing him from having adequate access to his lawyers. Have they done... Indeed, I mean, most people wouldn't think it was a terrible thing to be free of lawyers, but, you know, there are times when they're useful. What have they done wrong? Well, they're up to their old tricks, denying basic human rights at every turn. I mean, Bradley Manning might just as well be in Guantanamo Bay for the sort of treatment which he is receiving. And this for a country which was founded on the principles and ideals of the rule of law. USA has really disgraced itself many times in the last few decades, but especially in its treatment of Bradley Manning and in its attacks on Julian Assange. Australia, well, what have we done? Well, the first thing we did, day one, was to denounce him. The Prime Minister denounced him as a traitor. They promised that they would help the USA bring him to justice. They threatened to cancel his passport. Well, what's wrong with that? Well, I'll tell you what's wrong with it. We bloody well betrayed one of our own citizens. From the time of Hobbes and Locke and the English Civil War, it has been plainly understood that in Western democracies, the basic transaction between citizen and state is that citizens cede some of their autonomy and hand it to the state. They owe loyalty to the state, and the state owes them protection, which is the very reason that we have states. Forgive me for being a lawyer just for a moment, but in the famous trial after the Second World War of Lord Haw Haw, the legal argument turned on this principle, that a person who gets the protection of the state by holding the passport owes them a duty of loyalty. Treason and the state's obligation to protect are opposite sides of the same coin. What Julia Gillard did was the converse of treason. She betrayed an Australian citizen, and of course it's not the first time we've done it, because it was done to David Hicks, it was done to Mamdouh Habib. But then let's think for a moment. How many of the people in this hall turned out in numbers like this to support David Hicks for the first 5 years of his detention? I suspect many of you did, but I suspect also that many did not. And across the community, let us not forget, for the first 5 years of David Hicks' incarceration, the public at large were unconcerned, even though we knew what was going on, even though we knew that he was being tortured in Guantanamo. Did you ever see a rally in support of Mamdouh Habib while he was being held by the Americans in Guantanamo Bay? The answer is no. Let's not be too bold when we criticise the present government for betraying Julian Assange. Let's not forget that we also, as a people, betrayed Hicks and Habib. And governments learn from that. They know that they will get away with it if we let them get away with it. That's why it's so encouraging to see the response to the treatment of Julian Assange. Perhaps we have learned something from what happened to David and to Mamdouh. It's an interesting thing about the book. It'd be fascinating if they do try and recover the proceeds from the book as proceeds of crime. I'm thinking it mightn't be a bad idea to counterclaim for damages for the way the government betrayed him and allowed him to suffer. What about Sweden? Well, Sweden had this on-again, off-again investigation, all very peculiar. They didn't charge him. When he asked permission to leave the country, they said, yes, you can go. But then, when the Americans had a hissy fit, the Swedes suddenly jumped into action and decided to try and extradite him. Only when America was embarrassed did Sweden decide that it was important to try and extradite him in order to question him, to see whether there was an offence disclosed. Now, this issue has actually divided the ranks to some extent, because those who are concerned about sexual crimes will understandably think, well, you know, if Assange is guilty of these things, then maybe something, it's not too sure exactly what. Let me remind you of what was said recently by Naomi Wolf in an article. She has for more than 20 years worked investigating sexual crimes around the world. And she wrote this: "Never in 23 years of reporting on and supporting victims of sexual assault around the world have I ever heard of a case of a man sought by two nations and held in solitary confinement without bail in advance of being questioned for any alleged rape, even the most brutal or easily proven. In terms of a case involving the kinds of ambiguities and complexities of the alleged victim's complaints in Assange's case, sex that began consensually, that allegedly became non-consensual when dispute arose around a condom, please find me anywhere in the world another man in prison today without bail on charges of anything comparable." Then she goes on. She goes on, "Keep Assange in prison without bail until he's questioned, by all means, if we are suddenly in a real feminist worldwide epiphany about the seriousness of the issue of sex crime. But Interpol, Britain and Sweden must, if they're not to be guilty of hateful manipulation of a serious women's issue for cynical political purposes, imprison as well, at once, the hundreds of thousands of men in Britain, Sweden and around the world who are accused." Anyone who thinks that the extradition is actually about alleged sexual crimes has been living in sad isolation for too long. And what about all of us? What about all of us? What have we done? Well, you came here tonight, and that's pretty good. It's a good start. But is it enough? Is it enough? Of course it's not enough. Of course it's not enough. Now, I got a ring this morning from Julian's mother, Christine, and she is very keen that I ask all of you to contact your local member, state and federal, contact all of them and ask them individually what is their position on the present treatment of Julian Assange. What is their position on our government's stand in relation to Julian Assange? Make sure and force them into the open. Make sure that they are forced to face the realities of democracy in circumstances where the people are disturbed by what the government is doing in our name. And remember, this is not a partisan issue. Senator Trude for Liberal Queensland and Senator Brandis, a person with whom I rarely agree, have both actually done some fairly handy things in connection with this. You may find yourself with strange bedfellows in attacking the present government for their indifference to the fate of Assange, but no matter. Treat it as an interesting experience. I wanted to pick up on something that John mentioned about the sort of laws that might be passed and the leaked document that showed what is the greatest threat to our democracy, and journalists ahead of the list. A badge of honour, I agree. But there was an interesting piece of legislation in Britain a few years ago. It dealt with people who were non-citizens in Britain, who were accepted as refugees, but who were thought to be risks so far as engagement in terrorist activity was concerned. And what the legislation did was to allow the government to lock these people up indefinitely for the protection of the community, even though they were not guilty of any offence. Incidentally, it's exactly what we do to asylum seekers who aren't even thought to be guilty of any offence, but let that pass. The legality or the validity of that law went to the House of Lords, and the House of Lords, in a devastating 8-1 judgment, dealt with the fact that the law had the effect of jailing innocent people, denying them their rights in circumstances where they had done nothing at all wrong, and they acknowledged that it was done in order, ostensibly, to make the country safer from terrorism. And Lord Hoffman's speech ended up with the devastating observation that the safety of the nation is less endangered by terrorist suspects than it is by laws like that. It brought to mind an observation by Wendell Phillips in 1852 in a speech which is only remembered as to one fragment. He said that the price of liberty is eternal vigilance. Power, he said, is ever stealing from the many to the few, and the Democrat in office soon hardens to a despot. There are words that are as true now as they were then. One of the things that you must do when you leave this hall tonight is vow to hold the government to account. Hold them to account for their denial of the basic obligations that they owe to Julian Assange. Hold them to account for their basic denial of the principles of free speech, especially political free speech. Hold them to account for their apparent ignorance of the notion of the presumption of innocence. You have to hold them to account, and remember, we can, if we try hard enough, long enough, reclaim our democracy. We will not yield our democracy to the people in Canberra. And as you do it, remember the words of Lincoln that we have in this country, as in America, a government of the people, by the people, for the people. And that's us. It will not be quick. It will not come easily. It is not enough to sign a petition or write one letter or ring up Alan Jones just once. It will take more than a night. It will take more than a week. Because after all, these people are playing out old habits. And if they can get away with them when the media cycle moves to other things, if they can get away with it because we get tired, they will continue to behave in exactly the same ways. And next time it won't be Julian Assange's turn, it'll be Andrew Wilkie's turn, or John Pilger's, or maybe Mary's, or one of you. But you can bet on it, if we don't stand up for this now, it will be one of you eventually. And like the other speakers on the panel tonight, I do know that these things can get quite tiring. These things can be fairly exhausting because, as Andrew has told you, when you take on the government, you can expect them to play dirty tricks and treat you harshly. But let me tell you one piece of advice. Never give up. Never give up. Never give up.
Never give up. Thank you for that advice, Julian. And I have to fess up, I haven't rung Alan Jones even once. Thank you for reminding us of our responsibility to be vigilant and not let the government get away with demonising people. Now, the floor is open to you. There are 4 microphones, 2 at the front and 2 at the back. So please come to the microphone if you have a question to ask. And if I could ask you to please keep the questions short and sharp, because if you precede them with long statements, then fewer of you are going to get the opportunity to ask a question. And I'm going to have to cut you off. Right. Well, no one... Oh, right. Microphone 1. Could you please start by giving us your name?
Yep,
Thank
sure.
you.
Martin Zavan, 9MSN. What effect will a successful prosecution of Bradley Manning have on WikiLeaks and whistleblowing more generally?
Sorry, who... and also, I should have said, please tell me whom you're directing your question to.
I wouldn't mind if the whole panel could respond to that one.
Thank you.
Can I start on that? Yes. Can I be heard? The answer is nothing, and the reason is that the First Amendment right of free speech in the US means that the publication would not be an offence, even though the leaking was an offence. And the only exception to that, as was established in the Pentagon Papers litigation, is if the leaking creates a real and present danger, and there's no suggestion of that in this case.
Anyone else on the panel like to comment?
Julian has answered it.
Yep, great. Okay, microphone 2. Thank you, sir. Your name?
Joe Nagy. Would a Bill of Rights, the question is about a Bill of Rights, would this offer the people you've talked about who've had their rights denied, as well as protecting the rights of people you claim are in danger now? Would that have any protection for us? And the next question is, follows from that, is why isn't the government proceeding with a Bill of Rights? Thank you.
Well, that's really 2 questions. The second one, why they're not proceeding, I have no idea, except that they're gutless. As to the first part, the sort of Bill of Rights that we were discussing in the Brennan inquiry would help make a difference, but it wouldn't have the trumping effect that the US Bill of Rights might have. That said, one of the great benefits of a Bill of Rights in this country would be to help cultivate an understanding in the community at large that human rights are things that we need to think about, understand and honour. And that sentiment in the community is sadly lacking.
I think the only, if I could just add a very brief comment, and I'm new to this political business, only been there 6 months, but it's abundantly clear to me, probably already abundantly clear to all of us anyway, that the political parties, the government, the opposition, they approach everything, they look at everything through the prism of their political self-interest. What's easy, what's hard, what will win them votes, what won't, what's the balance of votes. And they have obviously judged that on this particular issue, this government has judged on this particular issue it's not worth pursuing. And I think, yes, that is gutless.
Thank you. Lady at the back.
Alison Bronowski. Anybody, all 3 of you if you wish, it is a shame, with everything that you've said, that nobody has mentioned Dr. Hanif. Surely his case requires as much attention as the others you've mentioned.
I think, well, you're right. Dr. Hanif's case should be taught in schools, should be perhaps on the front pages of our minds, if not our newspapers, all the time, because it demonstrates the utter cynicism that has come from Canberra. And the purpose of this meeting is to ensure that, although they're not the same, they're not exactly the same, but in principle there are many similarities, that the same thing does not happen again to Julian Assange.
So I'll go to the next
Mary,
lady at the back.
Can I have a little go at that? I think it's a good question, Alison, but I don't actually agree with it. And the reason is it was not about a country betraying a citizen. Really, the lesson we should learn from Hanif's case is this, that we, the community, stood by indifferent whilst he was jailed because we thought he was guilty. Despite the presumption of innocence, the community at large thought he was guilty. The mood turned as soon as it was demonstrated that he was innocent. And then all of a sudden the treatment that had been okay looked terrible. Now that's a problem in the community. And one of the things I really urge you tonight is for all of us here to remember this is not just bad conduct by a government. It is bad conduct which the community allows the government to get away with.
Yes. Sorry, can't hear you.
My name's Roshan Hill.
I'm sorry.
That's
problem with that mic.
demonstrating here.
I'm sorry, your mic's not working. Until Evo sorts that out, we'll have to come back to microphone 1 and start again. Thank you. Evo number 1 down the front, please. Yep.
Thank you. My name is Anne Picot. I'm an archivist. The reason I want to address this question is because all three speakers have alluded to the main crime of Julian Assange's WikiLeaks has been to embarrass governments by the revelations of things like the cables. What I would like to ask the panel, but most particularly Mr Wilkie and Mr Pilger, what is wrong with our knowing the deliberations that go on in government and between governments when it deals with matters of life and death, like the matters of going to war?
I believe it is fundamentally in the public interest that sort of information be aired. The only qualification I would add is that it is not right if information would put our national security genuinely at risk or put people's lives genuinely at risk. Now, I emphasise the word genuinely because the best that I can make of everything that WikiLeaks has so far revealed is that at no time has the national security of any country been put at risk, and at no time has anyone's lives been put at risk. I think you've hit a really important nail on the head here. At the end of the day, the biggest problem for governments is that it's embarrassing. Most of the time, I've found it entertaining.
Well,
Sorry, Don, did you want to say?
Really echo what Andrew has said. It's, I mean, the incredible public service that WikiLeaks has done right across the world is to tell us how systems work in secret in, quote, democracies. Now, that is the most essential thing, because that old maxim of information is power applies here, it applies in the United States, it applies all over the world where countries have the pretension of democracy. Jefferson described free information as the currency of democracy. And the indifference, the cynical indifference in Canberra that Andrew has described so well is something that we have to address. As Julian is right, we have to walk out of this hall and address a system that is calcified, that has got down to power for the sake of it. In goes Tweedledee, out goes Tweedledum. And that in the end is something that has to be changed. It can only change when we have the information that will be in the end our power, in the same way that the people of the Middle East, particularly Egypt and Tunisia, finally got information that was their power.
Thank you. Microphone 2.
Honourable gentleman, lady, I wish to ask you a question. What is democracy?
Thank you,
Leslie
sir.
Monk is my name, and I speak for my father, First World War, my cousins who fought in the Second, and I ask you, what is democracy?
Thank you, sir.
When?
Thank you, sir. Well, you know, philosophers have written about democracy, have written volumes and libraries.
When you have a Liberal Party that is controlled by the Mason Order, and when you have a Labor Party controlled by the Fabian Society, you've got no democracy.
Thank you. Microphone 3, at the back.
Hello, my name is Natalie Kay, and I'm probably one of the many thousands of whistleblowers around this country. My question is simple. You may win your case in courts, if you're lucky, as a whistleblower, but then there are the dreaded blacklists, where you're put on these secret blacklists and you can't work. So I'm just wondering if the panel can make any comments about how can we bring the blacklists into the open.
I completely agree with you that that's a problem, and it is ultimately a function of what the community is prepared to tolerate. You know, that when the community at large makes it clear to government that they will not tolerate reprisals against people who, like Alan Kessing, brings out important truths, when politicians know that they will not get away with the system taking reprisals, then it will stop. But only when they realise that their political self-interest is served by stamping out reprisals than by tolerating them.
Agreed, and further to my comments in my little speech before, it's a cultural problem in Australia. Whistleblowing, to be a whistleblower is a bad thing in Australia. People respond negatively to the term whistleblower. And to turn culture around in a place like Australia, you need leadership from politicians, you need education in schools, you need all sorts of inputs to turn that culture around over time. You know, I said my story has a happy ending, and it has a very happy ending. But for every Wilkie, there are thousands and thousands and thousands of whistleblowers in Australia. They might, if they're lucky, get a splash in the local paper, or if, you know, a couple of days splash in the local paper, or even make the Sydney Morning Herald. But then the media cycle moves on, and they're left with no job, no friends, no income, no hope. And it is unsurprising that the suicide rate is significantly higher among whistleblowers compared to the national average. With changing the culture, hopefully the problem will be overcome and people will be able to get jobs. You know, I couldn't get a job in Tasmania. I applied to not-for-profit organisations. I applied to the state government. I could not get a job, and I ended up buying a Persian rug shop. And I do like to joke that but what does it mean when the Persian rug seller becomes a member of Parliament?
Can I just add to that? I agree with the remarks about the responsibility of the community, but we have the voice of the community, the distorted voice of the community, is something called the media. And those people on the blacklist ought to have been the subject of the kind of investigative journalism that so threatened the Ministry of Defence in London. It should have been on the front pages. It should have been a media debating point instead of the so often facile, celebrity-driven and often obsequious journalism that passes for our media in this country. And that's something that I suggest we have to change. In a way, if we're going to change our attitudes in the community, yes, we have to change the way we think ourselves. But, I mean, if you look at the numbers of people who've come here tonight, look at the numbers who voted for Andrew when he stood up against Howard in his own seat. I'm not sure that whistleblowers are really that unpopular, but we need to know about them. We need to know what they give up, the sacrifices they make, but above all, how important they are to us and our democracy.
Eva, we're going to try microphone 4 again. That lady's been standing there very patiently all this time.
My name's Roshan Hill, and I would just like to ask what you think about the Northern Territory's intervention and why we do not stand up for the Aboriginal people. We pay lip service, and this is the second group that I've been to that the lip service has been paid, but there has been no attention to the broken bones in jails of the Aboriginal people. Is anybody going to stand up for them? Do either of you three think that the Northern Territory intervention program is illegal?
Well, if I could say that nothing substantially will change in this country until we make our peace and give justice to the Indigenous people of Australia, nothing. It is the intervention is one of the great historic scandals of this country, and every day we see politicians, Mackie, Gillard, others, trying to justify what is a very old-fashioned colonial land grab. They made the mistake, this quirk of the Fraser years, of giving the Northern Territory, the people of the Northern Territory, land rights, when in fact Justice Woodward recommended that land rights should be universal throughout Australia, but Whitlam had gone by then. This quirk meant that the Northern Territory got land rights, and ever since then, every government, Labor and Liberal, have tried to claw those back, and that they should try to do it under the false flag of lurid tales of paedophilia among our First People is one of the true disgraces of this country. Thank you.
Thank you. Number 1 down the front, please. Yes, sir.
My name is Andrew Partos, and I heard you saying, Julian, that who stood up for David Hicks. Well, I happen to be in Tony Abbott's electorate, and I always have a go at him. And I mentioned it years ago, that it's every democratic government's duty is to protect its citizens, and if he's not charged, why doesn't he bring it back? Why the British asked for their prisoners in Guantanamo Bay, and they were repatriated to England. There was at the Sydney Opera House, there were performances about Guantanamo Bay, about David Hicks, and I went to one of them, and it was announced that Major Moore is going to appear on the stage, and you can ask questions. So I put my hand up straight away, and I said that President Bush wants to introduce democracy into Iraq. When is he going to introduce democracy into the United States? And Major Mori, in his uniform, in front of the whole public, he said, "I don't think anytime soon."
Okay. Did you have a question, sir?
I think we
it was a really good story. We enjoyed it. I think we're going to come to microphone 2 now.
I think we're going to take it as a comment, but you have my commiserations living in Abbott's electorate.
Thank you.
Hello, everybody. My name is Nikki, and I am a victim of Islamic regime in Iran. Brutal Islamic government in Iran has killed my mother, and other 12 members of my family and relatives have been killed by Islamic regime in Iran. My question is to Andrew. Dear Andrew, as we know, WikiLeaks has published hundreds of documents against the brutality of Islamic regime in Iran, that Iran is one of the worst countries in the world that has absolutely no freedom of speech. And they have killed tens of thousands of political prisoners in only one night. Do you think, is that not the time that Australian government has to cut his relation to brutal Islamic regime in Iran? And if it is not shameful that Julia Gillard is a woman and she is supporting a brutal regime, that they are stoning the woman in such a barbaric way. We had just a few days before International Women's Day and we had thousands of people on the street and they were shouting for women's rights. And I was one of the members that had performed against the brutality of stoning the woman in Iran. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
I have had, in my 6 months in this job, I've had a number of Iranians approach me and voice their concerns about the situation in Iran for all sorts of reasons, whether it be the Baha'i or Christians or Muslims who, for all sorts of reasons, are being persecuted by the current regime. I will continue to champion the cause for the Australian government to be much stronger wherever it can be. However, I would voice some concern with cutting off diplomatic relations with the people who we have concerns with, because that is in some ways a step towards conflict. I think it is actually productive to maintain a conversation, even with the people we might despise the most, and try and use a peaceful means.
Gentleman at microphone 3, please.
Thank you. My name is Patrick Morgan and I have a quick question and hopefully a quick answer for the 3 panellists and perhaps a show of hands from the audience. Julian Assange I thank for all that people thank him for here, but I also thank him for alerting me to the media and in terms of its integrity. We see the media, we watch the news, we never see what date it is. Footage is shown, file footage at best. Does the panel think, does the audience think that we might be better served, the media might have more integrity, especially for the historical record, if it contains time, date and place as appropriate? Show of hands please from the audience.
Okay, will media representatives please note? Does anyone want to comment?
Yes.
Yep. You're right. Okay. Short answer. Thank you.
Look, if I could make a general point, I do feel that while there are some excellent news services in Australia and some excellent journalists, I do think that particularly when it comes to foreign and security issues, the Australian media is terribly lacking. And the issue that preoccupied me 8 years ago, I think the media did a woeful job when it came to the Iraq War. And today, I mean, who knows what's going on in Iraq these days? Australian troops aren't there, so there's no media there to cover it. We don't know what's going on there. I think there are a number of significant problems with the media in Australia to this day. I've been most concerned with the campaign. Now, I'm not any particularly great fan of the Gillard government or the Abbott opposition, but I don't think it's right for the Australian newspaper to run such an overt anti-government campaign the way it's doing. Yes, there are many, many problems.
You didn't want to comment, John? No? Okay. The gentleman at microphone 4, please.
Andrew Catalaris. It's a question for John Pilger. John, you've done a great job over the years documenting the transformation of the land of the free to a brutal privatised police state. And as a student of history, you must be aware of the role of the Reichstag fire in facilitating a progress to fascism. On September 11, 2001, as well as the 2 World Trade Towers, Building 7, a 47-storey building, collapsed to dust on the ground without being hit by an aeroplane, and nothing more has been said of it. Building 7 contained FBI investigations of Enron and a whole lot of other financial dealings, which would have been greatly embarrassed to the ruling elite in the United States. Why the silence applying to probably one of the most pivotal events of this century?
I don't think there's been silence. In fact, if any subject has been examined, certainly in a popular sense, as much as what happened before, during and immediately after 9/11, I can't think of it. But you're quite right to raise the question, and there are some outstanding questions. If you look at the Keane report, the official report, it itself says that witnesses were denied willfully by the government to that committee, that official committee that examined what happened. I'm not one who moves into the US government did this on purpose in order to do what it has done since. That said, there are so many questions raised and have been raised by senior figures within the American establishment, including senior FBI people who tried to alert the government to the real possibility of a terrorist attack at that time. These questions have not been answered. The extraordinary question of the building that collapsed, Building 7, I think it was, which hadn't been struck, the question of nanophysics and what has been found in the rubble of all those buildings. There have been multiple minor, if you like, relatively minor cover-ups around that. In many ways, some of the more extreme theories have given the US authorities the excuse to say that we're not going to examine it, we're not going to look at it. It's one of those great national tragedies that has to be avenged. But there's no doubt through modern American histories there have been what Professor Peter Dale Scott, one of the great authorities on this, I believe, has called deep events. Deep events have happened. False flag events has happened. We know Vietnam, Gulf of Tonkin so-called incident that started that off, that got Johnson going to Congress to give his extraordinary war powers, get his extraordinary war powers from them. That was a false flag. There's no question about that. So we have a long way to go to understand the extraordinary times we live in, and those questions, you're right to raise those questions, and certainly as a journalist, I believe that journalists should be looking at them in the most serious way, not simply as something to sensationalize about, but to examine and analyze and begin to put pieces into that puzzle.
Julian and Andrew, you didn't want to comment? Right. Microphone one down the front. Thank you, sir.
Yes, my name is Peter Grulemans. My question is to any of the panellists that feels best able to answer it. If we do break free of American protection, and I believe we should, and I support everything that's been said by you tonight, how do we as Australians prepare physically and mentally and spiritually to defend ourselves and to guard the oil supply, because I think that's what's behind it?
Look, at the risk of getting myself into strife here tonight, although I feel very strongly that we shouldn't be kowtowing to the US and putting our bilateral relationship ahead of the Australian national interest, our public interest, I personally am in favour of a strong alliance relationship with the US and a strong alliance relationship with any number of other countries. I just believe that we will be taken more seriously by the United States if we sometimes say no. You know, New Zealand says no, Canada says no. I think we would have a much stronger relationship with the US if we said no, because we wouldn't be taken for granted. And they would know that, you know, they need to treat us as an equal partner and do the right thing by us. And when they can put up a good case and when they genuinely need our help, we'll be there to help them as an ally, just as we might be there to help the Japanese at this point in time and any other country that we should regard as an equal.
I agree completely. We should be in a partnership with them. They did away with slavery a long time ago, so they shouldn't treat us as their slave. We're not going to do everything they ask.
I would just, thanks for raising that, I would just ask the question, why don't we grow up? Why don't we grow up? Why do we stop? Why do we have one of the most thoroughly colonised mentalities of any settler state in the world. Now, much of that is to our great advantage. We take on institutions from the United Kingdom, and we take on certain value from our friendship with the United States, culturally and otherwise. But when are we going to stop this nonsense about needing protection? This is one of the safest countries in the world. And we have no standing. Let me tell you, I've reported from Washington. We have no standing in Washington. They regard us as lackeys. They may like us, because they think we're like them. But they don't have any respect for us. And the whole question of never saying no, always being there. Gillard's speech made me almost come out in something. I thought Menzies' "I did but see her passing by" speech was wonderful compared with that. I'm proud of where I was born. I think I'm very lucky to have been born in this country, to have the opportunity of not having been born in a very impoverished society. But the problem remains that this country will be thought of so little in the great community of nations until it becomes itself, until it stops supporting imperial wars. And it's been doing that. It's been doing that since the Boxer Rebellion, or since the Sydney Tram Company sent a load of horses over to help General Gordon in Khartoum. Unfortunately, they died on the way, but the gesture was made, and we've been doing that knee-jerk again and again and again, and the question remains, when are we going to grow up?
Microphone 2, up the front. Thank you.
Hello. My question is to John Pilger. My name is Shelley Dahl. And I really liked the quote that you said that on one of those secret documents that journalists are considered a threat. Well, we Reds know what that's like every day. So my question is Julian Assange, he spoke out for people to know the truth, to actually do something to make fundamental change in this society. What can we do to not only continue to encourage whistleblowers like him to step forward and break the silence, but most importantly, when will it reach a point where the lie will become completely ridiculous and the truth will win out?
Well, I think all three of us have made the point that it really is up to us here tonight. It's very, very important, as Julian has said, that we don't leave this hall and think, well, that was good, we feel good about that, that was interesting, we've done something. Yes, we've done something by coming here in the numbers that you have, but it's the moment we step outside these doors, outside this bubble, if you like, and the pressure that we ourselves bring on those who do things in our name. The kind of pressure that is not about simply writing a letter to the Sydney Morning Herald. It's not even about putting your name on an online campaign. That's all still pretty feel-good. It's not even about writing to your MP. You won't if you wrote to Rudd or Gillard. They don't reply now, you know. That courtesy, they may reply to some, but they don't really. That old democratic courtesy, even that is gone. So what is to be done? What has to be done is something called direct. And it may even involve civil disobedience. The freedoms that we have in Australia were won through direct action and civil disobedience. I know in my own craft of journalism, those early newspaper editors, like the editor of the Sydney Monitor, who was thrown in jail for malicious libel again and again before his campaign got rid effectively of Governor Darling, a dictator from this state. How we've regressed when we have this, when we have the 70% of the capital city press of this country owned by one man with extreme views. Now, what I'm speaking as a journalist, we have to make journalism and the media an issue. It's been too long. And you know, that's why, because WikiLeaks really has made it an issue in shaming journalism, in doing and saying, you know, we're telling the public what you people should have been telling them over the years, instead of just simply taking power at its face value. I was on an ABC program last night on ABC 24, and the hostility towards Assange and WikiLeaks, with the exception of perhaps one person, was like a presence. Why? Because he and WikiLeaks and what they have done shames them. And I think if we're going to take the kind of direct action that I'm proposing, we need to take it to those not only who say they speak for us in Canberra, but for those who say they speak for us without any democratic mandate. And that's in the media, be it the ABC, be it the Murdoch press, be it Fairfax. They have to be told.
I agree with all of that. I quite like what William Wilberforce did when he managed to get legislation through the English Parliament that brought an end to slavery. And what he did was to get a petition with something like 1 million names on it And it was an enormous piece of paper that you could have wrapped around the Parliament House building half a dozen times. You know, we should be able to do something like that. You get a few million signatures on it, and Andrew can introduce it to Parliament, but it has to be an enormous physical document so that the press, lazy as they are, will pick up on the idea that something's going on. But that'd be pretty good. A couple of million names, that's all we need.
Okay, now, ladies and gentlemen, look, we really are running out of time, so I'm sorry, but we're going to have one last question. Yes, it's you.
My name is Trish Burt. It's not a question, it's a request. I've just spoken to friends who are in Bahrain this morning, their time. The tents at Pearl Roundabout are burning. Demonstrators are being chased from the city centre by security forces, and they can hear that they're being fired upon. There are also helicopter gunships surveying the scene and watching people run back into what they refer to as villages, but honestly, they're suburbs. They're what we would call middle-class suburbs. I'd ask you to, in light of the fact that we have applauded the people of Egypt and Tunisia, I would ask you to watch the situation in Bahrain and other states. Bahrain is the home of the US Fifth Fleet with a troop of something like between 16 and 20,000 US troops there. There is an aircraft carrier with a further 8,000 US troops off the coast of Bahrain, all positioned to be securing the oil fields in Saudi Arabia. It is Saudi...
Sorry, I'm going to have to interrupt you. Thank you. You make very, very good points.
Thank you.
I'm sure we're all interested in that issue. But we are running out of time, so thank you very much.
No, thank you.
Now, I apologise to the people who are disappointed. I'm sorry, madam. I'm sorry. Look, there are lots of people that are disappointed. I'm sorry. There are a couple of things that I need to tell you before I invite John Pilger to close the forum quickly. That is that this forum is a free forum, and thank you very much for attending. On your way out, though, you will be asked to make a contribution to the Julian Assange Legal Defence Fund. You don't have to make a contribution, but if you do, I know he's going to be very grateful. If you don't carry cash on you, and I'm one of those people that don't, the WikiLeaks website has got the account details of the Legal Defence Fund. Now, the second really important thing to tell you is that this coming weekend is World Action Weekend for Bradley Manning. There'll be a protest outside the US Consulate in Martin Place on Sunday at 11 a.m. Third important thing I have to do is announce the winners of the Lucky Door prizes. Now, the first Lucky Door prize is a Tiffany Paloma Picasso sterling silver dove pendant donated by the new chair of the Sydney Peace Foundation, Beth Jackson, and it's won by Juliet Bennett. And please collect your prizes on the way out later. The second prize, a video of John Pilger's called Australia, and Julian Burnside's book Watching Brief, and the winner is Michael Holgate. The third prize, Andrew Wilkie's book Axis of Evil, Stuart Rees and Shelley Wright's book Human Rights, Corporate Responsibility, won by Natalie Greenfeld. Won't those people be sorry if they've already left? The fourth prize, Julian Burnside's Watching Brief, Stuart Rees's Passion for Peace. The winner is Esther Labano. Now, I'm going to say good night, and I'm going to invite John Pilger to close the forum. Thank you very much for coming.
Look, I think we've said from up here probably all we need to say, and what you've said has been so important. I would like to thank, first of all, Monica Baroni, the CEO of the City of Sydney, who I phoned in January when she was on holiday, and she called me back, and the idea for this fantastic meeting really kicked off thanks to her. I'd like to thank the Sydney Peace Foundation, Stuart Rees, and of course Mary, and the moment when I called Andrew and Julian, they unhesitatingly in their busy lives agreed to come here tonight, and I'm really grateful to them. I'm very, very grateful. I think that we should support Andrew's whistleblowing legislation, even if it means we all go to Canberra and stand there. We should support that. Andrew himself has said, of course, that won't solve the problem. Julian has said the same thing. We have to think about betrayal. We have to turn this ridiculous Orwellian idea that our citizens like Julian Assange have somehow betrayed us when our government has betrayed us. It's something that we have to take, and I repeat, to those who govern the airwaves, who govern the print, and who govern much of the internet. The highly restrictive Australian media. We have to go to them and say, all right, Edmund Burke once said that the Fourth Estate was something that would check power. Well, it hasn't done that. We need a Fifth Estate. We need journalists and lawyers and people who are genuine representatives. We need teachers. We need all members of the community coming together to monitor our media, to contribute to our media, to give us a democratic media. And we need the same applied to politics in this country. In other words, we need, if you like, a very quiet, not so quiet, revolution. No blood in the streets, no blood in the streets, please, none of that. But we need a change of thinking. And what is absolutely critical, and Julian has made this point so well, that the moment we leave the Sydney Town Hall, that's when all this begins. Because we mustn't throw away this incredible expression of several thousand people coming together to express their concern about what has happened to our country, what has happened to Julian Assange, and what will happen to us unless we do something now. Thank you.